que o pessoal entrando. Ele tá voltando já. Boa tarde a todos, todas. Good morning to you, good afternoon to you all, right? Not morning. Dando continuidade às atividades do nosso seminário, nós temos a última mesa intitulada História, Memória e Racismo. So, this is the very last panel we have in our seminar. E teremos nessa mesa 3 apresentadores. O primeiro será o Francisco Cunha Paz, que vai apresentar o trabalho O Presente do Passado da Escravidão, as Memórias da Escravidão e a lista de patrimônio cultural mundial da UNESCO no Brasil.
Boa tarde, me escuta? Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Vou apresentar em português. Infelizmente, tem uma barreira da língua ainda a vencer, né? Peço desculpas. Mas espero que vocês consigam acompanhar pelo PowerPoint, que está em inglês. Mas antes de iniciar, queria agradecer a coordenação do evento, né? Agradecer às colegas de mesa, a professora Raquel também, e a oportunidade de socializar um pouco de uma pesquisa que está em início também, mas ela é um desdobramento de algumas inquietações da minha pesquisa de mestrado, onde eu pesquisei as agências de comunidades negras em torno do Cais do Valongo, né? As disputas sobre o sentido do Valongo que emergem junto com os vestígios do cais, e como isso está representado no processo de escolha do cais e depois na sua gestão, né? Chegando até os dias atuais, com essa construção de um comitê gestor que avalia todas as políticas para o sítio do Cais do Valongo. E uma pergunta, ou na verdade uma inquietação que surgia desde essa época era de onde vinha ou como a gente podia lidar com a dificuldade de sujeitos e coletivos negros e não negros em tratar as memórias da escravidão dentro dessa chave interpretativa da dor, do trauma, da tragédia e da barbárie. Né? De como que isso ainda é um desafio, seja para coletivos negros, como para sujeitos políticos e agentes políticos não negros também. Pelo menos aí nos últimos 30, 40 anos, esse debate em torno do passado da escravidão ou desse passado escravista transatlântico, ele tem tomado esse cenário público, né, nível do Brasil. Recentemente, isso ganha uma nova atenção, ou a mídia passa a cobrir isso de uma maneira mais atenta no mundo e no Brasil, após a insurgência do Black Lives Matter, do Rhodes Smuts Fall, né? Do assassinato de George Floyd, tudo isso que vem na esteira desses movimentos, né? Mas isso não começa de agora, né? Nem no mundo, nem no Brasil também, mas a mediatização em torno disso vem muito a partir desses movimentos e de uma adaptação ou de uma reinterpretação dessa reivindicação da derrubada de monumentos, né, ou da retirada desses monumentos, ou de contestação desses monumentos, dessas dessas celebrações, dessas homenagens públicas a sujeitos ou a eventos que estão ligados ao tráfico transatlântico, à escravidão. Esses sujeitos desses movimentos que eu citei passam a reivindicar a retirada dessas homenagens, desses monumentos com as próprias mãos. Aí a gente tem um evento das derrubadas, principalmente depois de março de 2020. Aqui no Brasil, né, a gente pode citar que a disputa por esse passado da escravidão, inclusive a contestação dessas homenagens, ela está muito atrelada a uma pauta histórica dos movimentos sociais negros, né? Ela não se inicia agora, mas assim, a gente vê uma intensificação desse debate ali no final dos anos 70, né, com a própria o surgimento do movimento negro unificado, mas também aí com a criação do Memorial Zumbi dos Palmares, na Serra da Barriga, o tombamento da Serra da Barriga como patrimônio nacional, a própria construção um maior investimento na construção dessa figura do zumbi como esse herói ali final dos anos 70, começo dos anos 80, o dia da consciência negra no Brasil, né? Só que essas disputas também não se dão só por esses sujeitos ou coletivos negros, elas também se dão por um movimento de extrema-direita a nível mundo, né? A nível nacional. No Brasil também a gente pode citar a resistência da inscrição do zumbi no Panteão da Pátria, né? A resistência à Lei 10.639 ou qualquer outra lei que também, de alguma maneira, está nesse aspecto de uma disputa pelo passado da escravidão, como a Lei de Cotas e o Estatuto da Igualdade Racial. A resistência a isso, mais recentemente, o surgimento do Escola Sem Partido, né? E do grupo Brasil Paralelo também, assim, as disputas por esse passado da escravidão, ela está nesse cenário público por esses diferentes atores, né? E guardadas as devidas especificações, no Brasil a gente tem esses anos 80 como esse grande cenário de disputa, e para minha pesquisa, por que eu faço esses dois recortes, né? Tanto porque eu cito os patrimônios mundiais, porque olhar para eles, e porque de 1980 esse ponto de partida. Por esse contexto, um pouco, mas também porque é um momento onde o Estado brasileiro, pelo seu Instituto de Preservação, né, de Memória, seu Instituto Oficial de Memória Nacional, se coloca como uma década de vanguarda na mudança de olhar para esse passado colonial e de valorizar esse patrimônio nacional, de conseguir materializar nessa lista desse patrimônio nacional o que é essa diversidade desses sujeitos que começa a emergir ali nos anos 80, com a Constituição e esses outros aspectos que eu falei. Mas vou passar um pouco, aí eu acabei dividindo a apresentação nesses 3 tópicos, né? Porque falar um pouco por que esses sítios históricos de patrimônio mundiais, as minhas escolhas, né? Porque essas 4 cidades, assim, a pesquisa, ela hoje, não sei até quando, como disse a professora Cristina Melega, não sei até quando se sustenta essa escolha de 4 cidades para serem observadas, né? Na verdade, são 4 processos de patrimonialização da cidade de Olinda, Rio, Salvador e São Luís, né? Como assim, cidades com importância durante o período do tráfico, que são cidades patrimônios mundiais. Então, dentro dessa chave de uma leitura de uma cidade atlântica escravista, né? A ideia é falar um pouco disso, de como que essas cidades estão sendo patrimonializadas como patrimônio cultural mundial, e essa leitura desses territórios como um território de uma memória difícil, ou do que a gente chama dentro da literatura de patrimônio difícil, né? E esse passado traumático. Vou andar. Mas é isso, assim, a ideia, a escolha dessas 4 cidades se dá exatamente pela importância que elas têm no período colonial, né, e de como que elas estão ali entre os principais portos escravistas desse período, né, com um volume. Todas elas, em algum momento, figuraram como esse lugar de entrada de um grande volume, e a própria Inaí, quando vai dizer que, de alguma maneira, essa escravidão ganha novos contornos, né, assim, no Atlântico, essas cidades também, a cidade em si ganha novo contorno, e essa escravidão faz com que as cidades como Olinda, Rio, Salvador e São Luís sejam parecidas em alguns aspectos, né? E de alguma maneira essa memória da escravidão ela está incrustada nesse espaço urbano, né? Nas edificações, na arquitetura, né? Obviamente a gente consegue fazer uma leitura do que é a arquitetura luso-portuguesa aí, mas também é possível observar essa cidade e ver uma cidade negra com uma dinâmica de vida, né, desses africanos escravizados que incidiram sobre essa cidade, mas também de como que essas mesmas edificações que em algum momento podem ser interpretadas como um gênio da ocupação humana, um gênio da criação humana, do ponto de vista arquitetônico de uma herança luso-brasileira, elas são também, em alguns momentos, né, tiveram por funções as edificações como mercados, né, os próprios pelourinhos, e outros espaços como as senzalas, e que hoje elas começam a ser reinterpretadas a partir de alguns coletivos negros, né, que na pesquisa se dá sobre o acompanhamento do que a gente está chamando no Brasil dessas rotas da escravidão, né, rotas negras, caminhadas negras, que são maneiras de reinterpretar esses sítios históricos já patrimonializados, contestando não a sua patrimonialização, mas contestando os valores que são atribuídos a esses bens, a esse território, né? Então, assim, acaba que, de alguma maneira, hoje, o turismo é reforçado e a necessidade de preservação desses espaços, ela também se dá por conta dessas caminhadas ou rotas afros, rotas negras, nesses sítios, tentando também incidir uma necessidade de preservação desses espaços, mas a partir de uma outra interpretação, né? Então, assim, de alguma maneira, a pesquisa também passa um pouco sobre como se dá a construção desses roteiros, né? Como que esses grupos, inclusive, estão lendo historiadores, estão lendo livros de historiadores publicados sobre essas cidades ou sobre o período da escravidão, do tráfico, e como que eles acabam utilizando tanto essa oralidade que existe nos territórios, né, como essa memória que é partilhada e construída por esses sujeitos, mas também com uma historiografia acadêmica profissional ali também, que não deixa de fazer com que vários desses roteiros também, e a pesquisa se debruça sobre isso, vários desses roteiros também, em algum momento, com certas narrativas que, do ponto de vista histórico, também não se sustentam, né? Um exemplo grande que eu vou dar para quem conhece Salvador é sempre isso, né? Que qualquer guia no mercado em Salvador vai dizer que o mercado modelo foi o principal mercado de africanos escravizados, né? E não há nada que sustente essa afirmativa. E isso e vários outros sítios históricos que a gente visita também, algumas dessas narrativas são construídas, assim, mas, ao mesmo tempo, essas narrativas desses sujeitos e desses coletivos negros também reinterpretam ou tentam trazer para esses espaços uma narrativa específica sobre a escravidão. E aí, para aproveitar meus 5 minutos, o que eu queria partilhar com vocês, acabei perdendo tempo no preâmbulo, é porque, assim, dessas 4 cidades, essas 4 cidades são patrimonializadas como sítio patrimônio da humanidade. Nos 4 processos, para uma cidade ser escolhida patrimônio mundial, ela precisa ser atribuído a ela 2 critérios de 10 critérios que a Convenção do Patrimônio Mundial diz, né? Pelo menos 2. E aí tem todo um processo, produzido um dossiê histórico, né? Com morfologia arquitetônica, tudo isso, e o próprio Estado, seja de onde for, no caso o Estado brasileiro, submete à UNESCO essa pesquisa para esse sítio ser avaliado como patrimônio mundial ou não. Dessas 4 cidades que eu citei, Olinda, Salvador, Rio, né, e São Luís, nenhuma delas tem a escravidão como ponto central, por exemplo, desse valor, mas mais que isso, isso é meio óbvio, inclusive, da gente imaginar que não vai ser a escravidão o eixo condutor da narrativa do surgimento dessas cidades. A escravidão só toma essa centralidade no Cais do Valongo, especificamente, né, bem recentemente, mas a escravidão, em alguns desses dossiês, elas nem aparecem. Assim, e aí eu estou falando a escravidão de uma maneira mais ampla, mas assim, nem a palavra ou qualquer palavra correlata, escravo, escravidão, escravista, nada disso em alguns desses dossiês é mencionado. Ou é mencionado, como no caso de São Luís, por exemplo, que a escravidão explica por que a cidade enfeiou em determinado momento. Quando o dossiê fala que quando a abolição chega, ou quando a escravidão diminui, a cidade perde poder econômico e a falta desse poder econômico se reflete no empobrecimento arquitetônico da cidade. Por exemplo, no caso de Salvador, o Pelourinho ele é descrito morfologicamente, né? O Pelourinho, no processo de patrimonialização do sítio histórico do Pelourinho, descreve o Pelourinho morfologicamente como uma estrutura em concreto, de forma triangular, ou descreve o que seria o largo do Pelourinho. Em nenhum momento é mencionado o Pelourinho como esse instrumento, né, de alguma maneira também de castigo a homens livres e escravizados que cometiam ou supostamente cometiam crime. Assim, não há uma narrativa que fale sobre isso, não há nesses dossiês também nada que destaque o mercado, a venda e a compra desses escravizados também. Em Olinda, por exemplo, a escravidão aparece para explicar que é ela que proporciona a riqueza do açúcar na região, mas assim, também ela está sempre, ou quando ela não aparece, ela aparece justificada em algum ponto economicamente ou em termos de riqueza dessas cidades. É isso, e aí, assim, para concluir, né, a pesquisa tenta, a partir de acompanhar, de analisar esses processos administrativos, né, IFAM, ICOMOS e UNESCO, fazer uma análise deles junto com essas rotas, tentando imaginar como é que esses sujeitos no presente estão tentando reinterpretar esses sítios. Eles não contestam a patrimonialização desses sítios, eles contestam o valor atribuído, eles tentam cumprir uma lacuna que os dossiês têm, por exemplo, a respeito da escravidão, ou a respeito da escravidão nessa chave desse passado traumático, né? Como um passado encerrado, tentando romper com essa ideia de um passado encerrado, que é muito, muito, muito comum nesse caso. A ideia é que a reinterpretação desse sítio como um lugar de dor, de sofrimento, né, de tragédia, de barbárie, também proporciona no presente a esses sujeitos, principalmente afro-brasileiros, a luta ou a garantia dos seus direitos políticos e sociais, de justiça social no presente. É isso. Obrigado. Vou sair daqui, né?
Muito obrigado, Francisco. The next panelist is Nina Nevill, and she's going to present us her paper entitled Dual Displacements, Marginalized Voices in Presentist Histories.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Nina Nevill, a PhD candidate at Rice University. And today I'm presenting on dual displacements, marginalized voices in presentist histories. I'll start off today by thanking those who organized this conference and for being such gracious hosts to us. I know we've all had an amazing time so far. Today, I'll share a little bit about my dissertation research and methods, and then share what my vision for this presentation and paper sort of were back in August. I'll end with what I hope to sort of have gained from attending this particular conference, and I think in honor of time and it being that time of day, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So just a little bit about my work, my project. The dissertation project centers the experiences of incarcerated African-American women in Houston, Texas. I argue that incarcerated women in the 20th century used everyday strategies of resistance to foster human dignity and a sense of self. So everyday strategies of resistance historiographically refer to building kinship networks, pursuing educational or work opportunities, and engaging in religious or faith-based practices, amongst many other things. The historiography that I refer to here is specifically the historiography of African American women, looking mostly at the 20th century, but I do know that this goes back quite a bit further as well. I use oral history methodology, so interviewing formerly incarcerated women to better understand their experiences, centering their narratives in the longer history of resistance. And just to keep everyone on their toes, I will jump around a little bit. I know we have to all stay alive and well, but I will return to this slide to go over the rest of my sort of project description. But methodology for me plays a really significant role in especially this dual displacement framework that I've set up for us today. So I want to go over that just a little bit before finishing about my project. So just as a little bit of a visual to have an idea, here are some of the topics that I've outlined in my interview guides. And these are really preliminary based on other research projects that use interviews, as well as my own sort of goals for the project. I anticipate that there will probably be many other topics added as I go on and interview. And I think that, I'm looking forward to those actually shaping more of the narrative. Like I mentioned, these are pretty rudimentary. And for our non-Portuguese speaking friends, myself included, some of these up here, we have womanhood, we have re-entry, writing workshops, reading, self-expression, motherhood, for example. And I mentioned motherhood here specifically just to also include a little bit about Texas and why Texas, I believe now in 2023, although I could be a little wrong, I think 8.1% of incarcerated women are parents, are mothers. So that's just for a little bit of perspective for our quant folks as well. So this is sort of the basis where I'm starting. Like I mentioned, I know I have a long way to go, and I'm really hoping that my project evolves alongside these women rather than sort of from the outside and then imposed in, although that's very difficult to escape, as many of us in academia know. So returning a little bit, the argument that I laid out earlier can be relatively dense. And so just diving more into the terminology, I mentioned everyday resistance is sort of a term that I've borrowed from other works and historians that I think fits well. And the other two that sort of come up quite a bit in the scholarship I read are human dignity and sense of self. So thanks, James, for bringing human dignity to the floor today to launch us into that. But these are two terms that come up quite a bit in studies of resistance. And although the studies I look at, like I said, are US 20th century more often than not, I think these are key terms really in any plight of a marginalized group. They sort of end up being goals more often than not. In my project specifically, human dignity and sense of self help formerly incarcerated women build the capacity needed to divest in and ultimately abolish the carceral system. So those are some of the metrics that I'm using, with the sort of end goal here being a little bit writing the line between scholarship and activism. And I'll get into the present implications later in my presentation as well. Okay. So back to this slide. In addition to borrowing terminology from historiography, as I've mentioned, you might be wondering how my research is considered history rather than something like sociology or journalism. But in this dissertation project, I outline how African American women in the US South have resisted institutions of violence and oppression as they've evolved over the long 20th century. So some of the benchmarks I consider include looking back at slavery in the mid-19th century, convict labor and the Jim Crow era, which was often like agricultural sort of prison farms is the term that we use. Then the industrial prisons of the mid-20th century, and finally what I categorize as this sort of modern militarized carceral system at the end of the 20th century. Eventually, I'd like to take this analysis even into the 21st century with this high-tech surveillance state, if you want to put it like that, not to be too grim. So again, this is not an exhaustive list of benchmarks, but it sort of helps me, it's helped me so far in tracing these acts of resistance over time and connecting them with the interviews of women who are incarcerated in the late 20th century. Another aspect that of this project that feels very historical, more so than in any other field, is the very obvious looking at change over time. But of course, here I'm also paying close attention to the continuities over time. So really being able to analyze the way that African American women have resisted during these different points in history, like I mentioned. So now that I've given sort of a brief overview of my project, I'll spend a few minutes talking about how I situate it within this dual displacement framework, which I've offered today as the title. Of the two dual displacements, the first that I outline is a very physical displacement, and I've identified that as women who were incarcerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, being displaced from their communities, from their homes, from their families. So that's a very physical displacement of being removed from a space and isolated in another space. That one's pretty straightforward. The second displacement is a more discursive one. And really it comes from this focus of mass incarceration in academia, at least in United States academia, which predominantly centers the experiences of men. Now, African-American men are disproportionately represented in the carceral system, so I understand absolutely where the scholarship and attention comes from. But that doesn't mean that scholarship isn't happening that centers the experiences of women as well. Right, so the scholarship exists, but it often shows up in these other fields like sociology, legal studies, women and gender studies. And what sets it apart from some of the really incredible, groundbreaking work, historical work we have on mass incarceration is that they're sort of isolated in the present moment more so than being able to connect them into the past, into the history of the United States. So a part of this project is also trying to do that and to draw some attention as well to better our understanding of the carceral system. There's another component here that is absolutely relevant, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, sort of writing that line between scholarship and activism. I believe that without the perspectives of incarcerated women and sort of a critical gendered analysis of resistance, it's unlikely that we'll have the knowledge and the capacity to abolish the current carceral system. So therefore, recognizing these acts, however inconspicuous they may be, can help us understand that capacity building. And so that is very much a part of the past as it is the present and in this current moment in 2023. So the other question you may be having is, how does any of this fit into presentism, which is also in my title? I'm going to try to stay out of hot water a little bit here with this as well. But as I mentioned, I had planned to talk about presentism, and for those who maybe aren't as familiar with it, it's the uncritical adherence. Uncritical is a really important word here. The uncritical adherence to present day attitudes, especially the tendency to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. So past events, modern values and concepts, but it's an uncritical look at it. So when I was writing the abstract, like I mentioned very ambitiously back in August for this paper, the American Historical Association published a rather controversial article about presentism, which drew in quite a bit of scholarly attention. I anticipated that I would have conducted about a dozen interviews by now back then. And so I wrote the abstract for this conference to discuss how the fear of presentism affects practices like storytelling and like oral history that often center more marginalized groups. But due to some unforeseen circumstances, I haven't been able to conduct any of my interviews yet. And actually last night got the approval to go ahead to do so, which is great news. Thank you. Oh, you don't have to clap for that. But thank you. I'm just as excited. Despite sounding very monotone, I'm just as excited. So anyways, this is sort of, lost my place. I got too excited, actually. So I'm a little bit more hesitant to speak about presentism, a little less prepared to speak about it today, given that it was going to be part of my consideration in practicing the interviews themselves, in seeing how they have turned out. So instead, I sort of, with this topic, I hope to open more of a conversation amongst this sort of more global network of historians. And I guess I come here today, like some of my colleagues, with maybe more questions than answers. And so what drives the next stage of my research as I dive into these interviews, I'm hoping to understand that, while we must preserve, right, this historical methods and theories that we have currently, how do we also make space for something like oral history methodology that requires and respects present perspectives, right? How does the fear of presentism affect work that addresses marginalized groups, especially those who may not benefit from traditional historical methods or approaches? And then, of course, how can we uphold the process of historical analysis with integrity and rigor, just as well as with empathy and equity? I'm going to preface this saying none of this is to say that any sort of traditional methods or approaches can't or don't produce work that has all that in it. That's certainly not a claim that I'm making. It's just that these traditional interpretations of rigor, for example, can sometimes serve as a barrier to this type of work. And so I'm more so open to analyzing that further, and have already had some great conversations with some of y'all here. Listening to the panel from this morning, to tie presentism in a little bit further, many of you probably in this room, 19th century historians and those who study earlier, would rather be able to interview people that you're researching, right? I mean, how many of you would sit down for an hour with maybe somebody that you've been researching? I think probably many, if given the option, right? And so I think it's a different type of work, obviously, than a lot of my colleagues that I've heard from today and over the course of the conference. But I think it's rather than looking at materials, being able to actually ask these questions outright, and then also understand what that means for future work, for future historians, of course, of the era. And I'm certainly not arguing for it as a perfect method either, just as one approach that we should and can embrace here. I'll conclude this presentation today in just a minute, but while I'm here, you might be wondering, why am I here in Brazil? I've talked a lot about the United States, and unfortunately my project does focus entirely on the US South and Texas, but I thought I would try to at least do a little bit of work to incorporate into more regional, sort of local histories. And again, this presents more questions than it does answers. I'm not equipped to make any comparative analysis, any comparative arguments, but I thought I would also just include this here as well, which is pulled from a website. This is women's incarceration rates from 2018, if it's visible up there. It's not great because this is just comparing founding NATO countries, but I went ahead with my great graphic design skills and added Brazil and Mexico in there. You won't believe how many times I won't go into that, but you can see maybe one of the reasons why, although I unfortunately don't have a transnational focus for this project, or at least for the scope of the dissertation, there's a good reason to give attention to Texas, and while we're there, I think it's worthwhile. That said, still we have Brazil and Mexico, and I thought I would add that into the mix. Just to give briefly, very quickly, I know I'm just about out of time here, but a little more information to situate some of what I'm doing, and then also why I'm here in Brazil. This is the importance of this project to me, like I mentioned, is just as much in perhaps the present and tells us about the present moment as it does the past, and in tracing the past. And I think I could argue eventually that this is common across the globe. We're seeing cases of this across the globe. In the last 2 decades, Brazil, for example, has seen an increase in their incarcerated population, a very large increase, I would say. The number of men has increased 293% in prisons and jails in Brazil, and for women, it's increased 656%. So I don't believe this is a problem that's going away anytime soon, and I think if we don't use the sort of experiences, the lived experiences of these women themselves, then we're sort of doing a disservice to the scholarship. I have a little bit more, but I think this is about time for me. So I mostly want to just say thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to any comments and questions you all have after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. The next and last panelist of our seminar is Olivier Péloquin, and I hope I have said that correctly. And his presentation is entitled, quote, I too am pure Southern Confederate stock. Colonel John Garland, James, Southern Culture Gatekeeper.
I'm just gonna put this right there. Well, there's got to be a last presenter for every conference, and I'm going to be the last one. I want to thank everybody that presented. It was amazing. I want to thank everybody that listened. It was amazing too. Like he said, my name is Olivier Péloquin. Bonjour à vous tous. Maybe one day French would be one of the language that we can speak at the RAM conference. So this project is a side project because I do believe that microhistory can help us discuss hot topics sometime, like the construction of racist narrative. So where did I meet John Garland James? Well, I first met John Garland James in the archive researching for the Rice Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice. When I investigated the first chairman of the board at Rice University and one of its main architects, Captain James A. Baker. John Garland James appeared in the Baker correspondence as the professor and superintendent of the Texas Military Institute, which Baker attended. But let us meet John Garland James in his own term. In 1928, in the twilight of his life, in a letter to his friend Samuel Ferguson, he presented his Southern genealogy. I too am of pure Southern Confederate stock. My parents were living in Richmond when war was forced on us, was forced on the South, and lived there through the entire war, the siege and capture of Richmond, and had 3 sons under the Confederate flag. And like nearly all Southerners that lost practically everything they had except 4 children. When he characterized himself as pure Southern Confederate stock, he revealed to the intended recipient of the letter his identity, and more specifically, as we will see in this paper, which interpretation of history he adheres to, the lost cause narrative. This research is part biographical, part intellectual history, and part cultural history, trying at each step of the way to uncover, through James' perspective, the white supremacist South he sought to create. It will explain how John Garland James conceptualized himself as a gatekeeper, or guardian of Southern culture, a gatekeeper who conscientiously inserted himself in broader intellectual discussion over the nature of Southern culture. And when I'm talking about Southern culture, I'm talking about white Southern culture, and the dire need to preserve it and or spread it. As W. Fitzhugh-Brundage says, collective or historical memory is not simply the articulation of some shared subconscious, but rather the production of intentional creation. But who is John Garland James? Well, he was born in 1844, December 1st, in Chatham, Virginia. He had an older brother named Charles and a younger one named Fleming. On August 11, 1862, he fulfilled his childhood dream, and for the first time, he wore the gray cadet uniform of the Virginia Military Institute. There are strong Confederate ties between the Virginia Military Institute and the Confederate Army. Some of the most what we can call brilliant officer, according to some, like Stonewall Jackson, were professor at the academy. In his life story, he linked his cadet day with the proud Southerner he will grow up to be. The professor and the benevolent and erudite gatekeeper of white Southern culture he sought to become. Less than 2 years after his enlistment at Virginia Military Institute, James took for the first time to the battlefield, where, with his comrade, he fought at the Battle of New Market on May 15, 1864. In July 1866, James graduated from Virginia Military Institute as a member of a cadet cohort trained in the antebellum. As his time at Virginia Military Institute came to a close, he may have been in the crowd listening to the school superintendent, Francis Annie Smith, on September 10, 1866. We may show that we have the power and the will to rise above the disaster of civil strife and maintain the unsullied purity or distinctive civilization. And while we may restore the ruin and desolation around us and give new direction to our industry, we may make progress in greatness as people and at the same time preserve the principle of truth and probity and right. What we see here is the ideological mission of the Virginia Military Institute to forge white, virtuous citizen. The glorious past of the old South, the valiant fight of the lost cause, and this new South that is supposed to rise on the ashes of the Civil War. This ideological background is going to be core to John Garland James' cultural endeavor. But what is the lost cause? In the United States, it's something that is widely discussed, where there's some key tenets. First, secession was not about slavery, was not the main reason for the war, but states' right. African American were faithful slaves, loyal to their master. And when the South was defeated militarily, they were unprepared for the responsibility of citizenship. The Confederacy was defeated militarily, but just because of the overwhelming resource of the North. And the fifth one, the most heroic and saintly of all Confederate, perhaps of all American, was Robert E. Lee. He deeply also resented Reconstruction era, embracing the dark legend spread about the apocalypse resulting from the imposition of biracial governance and African-American political participation in the aftermath of emancipation and the Civil War in the South. Reconstruction was understood, which is the era after the Civil War, as an abuse of power under the sign of federal bayonet, humiliating the white South by turning the society upside down. In other words, forcing a group of people, African American, into the political realm while they were not civilizationally. John Garland James, in his vibrant quote in one of his correspondence letters from 1928, described what was Reconstruction to him. I saw all the iniquity that went on and the humiliation that radical Black Republicans tried to put on the brave and young conquered people of the South. And I live in Austin, and I saw the halls of the legislature filled with N-word and carpetbagger. Mounted N-word police rolled around armed evilly over the county of Texas, arresting decent, respectable citizen and dragging them before a Freedmen Bureau man would find him or put him in jail. Upon graduation from the Virginia Military Institute, he relocated to Texas, where he opened in 1868 the Texas Military Institute, and later relocated the institute to Austin, Texas. The school closely resembled West Point and was ideologically in tune with Virginia Military Institute. But what does it mean to be in tune? We've seen the 1860 speech before. This is the speech in 1874 of Cadet Waylock in the valedictorian address to the people of Austin. Let us then live and work in the present. The past was important while we were at it, and that life with all its possibility, all its power and beauty is here. The present alone contains our vital problem. We may idealize the past and dream and fancy of a better time to come, but there is not and will never be another time than a continuous now. We can see some of the same theme, young white men, martial manhood, civic duty, and as some of the echo from also like the VMI speech, but also this vision of the future. In many ways, Texas Military Institute was instrumental to what historian Rod Andrew, defined as the flowering of the Legion of the Lost Cause. James saw himself as someone whose mission was to transform boys into men at the military academy and contributed to the edification of a particular vision of Southern identity through his teaching and textbooks publication, as we will see later, to make the link between the old and the new South. And as a lot of white men of his generation, he pretended to be outside the realm of politics. As we can see, not a public character. I don't feel that I could do any good, as I am unused to that line and unknown to the public. But how unknown to the public was he really? So, the content of the Southern Student Handbook that was published in 1879 by John Garland James can be really interesting because it provides evidence on the kind of political belief James wanted to spread across classroom, not just in the South of the United States, but also in the North, as we will see. The romanticization of the Old South, the sacrifice of Confederate soldier, and the wrath of Reconstruction under federal bayonet. In many ways, it anchored a refashioning of Southern white identity, not only in the Old South and Civil War, but also firmly anchored in Reconstruction era. If we can look at some of those titles, it's some are more self-explanatory than others, like the Caucasian race must rule. But let's look, perfect. Let's look at some of the description inside. So, we got James Barbour in The Slave of Madison at his grave that proposed a paternalistic vision and romanticized version of the relation between enslaved and enslaver. We're going to have James P. O'Connor that proposed the civilizing mission of slavery in his piece in the book. Or Linton Stephen, brother of Alexander H. Stephen, vice president of the Confederacy, that argues for a really Southern vision of what is Reconstruction and the destruction brought by Reconstruction. So the Southern Student Handbook presents a biased view of the trauma and trial imposed on white Southerners by Reconstruction. And by showcasing such piece in his book, James wanted to depict a vision of proud South resisting federal bayonets. He sought to teach the next generation to remember as some form of cautionary tale what could happen if they allowed government to support African American citizenship and biracial democracy. But what was James thinking about the handbook? Well, we got some of his private correspondence to have a better idea of the type of cultural endeavor he wanted to create. So, in a September 1877 letter to Paul Hamilton, whose work John Garland James will later edit, he described what he thought the Southern Student Handbook could achieve for Southern white culture. at which letter Ains responded in November 1877. I'm not going to read all the text because I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and I'm just going to repeat myself. And we need a bit of silence a bit after like 3 intense days of a conference. And also, chatting with his other friend, Sidney Lanier, he wrote a glowing review of James' book. And let's be honest, Paul Hamilton and Sidney Lanier are 2 of the most famous lost cause poets in the United States. They even have statue of themselves in the South. So by providing a textbook for Southern students, James also inserted himself in nationwide debate over education and which national narrative should be taught. In many ways, he prefigured what in the early 28th century, the United Daughter of the Confederacy did by placing Confederate flag, portrait of leaders such as Lee, and pro-Confederate textbooks in nearly every Southern classroom. But returning to Reconstruction also, this era, like other Southern white men of his generation, James wanted to shape not only how students reading his book will remember Reconstruction, but also how the country as a whole will remember it. And to finish, let's look at the press review, because John Garland James wasn't only talking to Southern public. The content of the student handbook spurred controversy all over the South and the North. And as we can see, in Pennsylvania, the superintendent of the school introduced it without knowledge of the member of the school board. So great was the indignation of the public. However, this has been ordered to be withdrawn. In some of the other more northern newspaper, they're gonna be really critical of the type of teaching that is inside such school book. As in the South, as we can see it in the Galveston Daily News, sang the praise of the textbooks. Its chief aim being to represent the New South by material gathered from those who, during this exciting period through which we have just passed, illustrated our Southern life sentiment and thought in their best phase. So, to conclude really rapidly, maybe I got a bit over and I'm sorry about this to keep you up. So in between the publication of Southern Student Handbook and the death of John Garland James in 1929, he had seen the lost cause spread in every classroom on the South under the auspice of the United Daughter of the Confederacy and other memorial association. But it bears the question, in the shadow, does people like James fulfill their cultural mission? And it bears also the question if microhistory sometimes is a great way to recover those who pretend that they're outside the realm of politics. We study a lot sometimes the politician and their role, but through recovering the path of somebody who pretended to be only an educator and a military man, and through recovering in his publication also the type of cultural endeavor he's trying to sell to the Southerner and Northerner in the United States, we may maybe tackle effectively the creation of those how do we construct those racist narrative and stop thinking about bystander as only being bystander. There's no such thing as being a bystander when you're editing those kind of volume. There's a political mission also that is behind those kind of publication. And sadly, we're still living in the shadow in the United States of the lost cause and how it was taught in school. There's still debate in Texas about which type of narrative should be told about the Civil War. So thank you for listening to me. Merci beaucoup et j'espère que vous allez apprécier.
Thank you, Olivier. Terminadas as apresentações, eu passo a palavra para a professora Raquel Gomes, que irá fazer suas considerações sobre as apresentações.
Is it working? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. First of all, I gotta say I'm a bit rusty, but I guess your guys are also very tired, so it's a win-win situation, right? So, yes. Those who were my students may remember a story I usually tell when talking about my research experiences in South Africa. In 2012, I was working at the Historical Archives at the Wits University in Johannesburg when, on a coffee break, I was asked about the museum dedicated to slavery in Brazil. I had just been to the Mandela Museum a few days before, so I must say I was profoundly ashamed when I answered that we don't have a museum dedicated to slavery in Brazil. The reaction made me even more ashamed. So how do you deal with such a big part of your past, your history? I was sure about the answer I gave on that occasion. We don't. Nowadays, I wish I could have other answers for this question. In Brazil, we deal with our past with violence. We deal with our past by denying it. We deal with our past, as these three presentations have showed us, by trying to change it, negotiate it, and in doing so, denying access to fundamental rights such as memory and belonging. Para o Francisco, peço licença, Francisco pediu para conversarmos em português. Francisco, entendo que o trabalho que você apresenta, como você menciona, é um trabalho inicial, né? Uma apresentação do seu tema, mas também me pergunto se é possível generalizar a ideia de cidades africanas para cidades que também, cidades negras, né? Black cities, as you, né? Como teste, som, pronto. Cidades negras, como você está falando, sem levar em consideração diferentes experiências econômicas, culturais, religiosas, né, circulação de pessoas, enfim. Então, acho que tendo a concordar com a ideia de que 4 cidades talvez seja muito, mas não quero destituir nenhum sonho, expectativa e ilusão, então queria ver como você está lidando com a perspectiva de trabalhar com 4 objetos, né? Enfim. Janina, first of all, congratulations on the approval. Yay! I gotta say that the only reference I had on this theme was Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, published in 2010. The book considers not only the cruelty of the American prison system, but also the way the war on drugs and the system have been used as a system of control that shatters the lives of millions of Americans, particularly Black and Hispanic men. In your research, I understand that gender is a major theme to be explored, as you mentioned it before. And one of the main topics I would like to ask you about, you just started talking about it, is the presentist histories. And I would like to perhaps ask for more profound information on this, because it's a new topic for me. And I also would like to ask you about, I understand about gender being a major theme and a major aspect of your work, but I also would like to perhaps tension it with other themes such as immigration, national boundaries, and how to face so many systems of control nowadays on top of gender and race, right? And to Olivier, I'm so sorry. It's Friday, right? It's Oliver, Olivier, whatever. James was, as you highlighted in your paper, unknown by most, and notwithstanding his cultural endeavor of spreading Southern cultural and literature, had come to fruition in the hands of others, precisely because of his Southern Students' Handbook of Selections for Reading and Oratory. Assuming the impact this handbook had on what we might call James' cultural project for a Southern history, I'd like to know more about it, more about the book. I mean, is it possible to trace how many copies were printed or sold? Do we have any information on circulation and distribution, or about contracts with printing houses? Another question I would like to ask you is about for what cultures is the gatekeeping working? I mean, what is it keeping from the Southern culture? thinking about print culture, particularly, I remember Black newspapers being organized and circulating in the South, and also narratives and biographies of slavery and life in slavery. So I would like to know more about this relationship with this past negotiated by the lost cause. Thank you all.
Obrigado, Raquel. The panelists can now address Raquel's notes in the order that they presented their papers. Francisco, pode ser o primeiro.
Obrigado. Bom, obrigado, Raquel, pelas considerações. Tentando pensar nas 4 cidades, de fato, tem um ponto que, né, é um desafio aí também, é como que a pesquisa ela nem é uma pesquisa sobre cidade, nem uma pesquisa sobre escravidão, né? Ela é, de fato, uma pesquisa sobre patrimônio, sobre patrimonialização. Então, assim, por mais que... E aí é meu entendimento hoje, inclusive eu gosto de dar título, porque o título ele cria essa expectativa para o futuro, né, que pode não se comprovar, mas também ele me dá um guia, seja de expectativa, seja no futuro eu conseguir entender como é que eu fui amadurecendo o pensamento ao longo do tempo, né? Mas o processo, pensando em processo de patrimonialização, essa documentação, apesar de muita, aí ela é bem mais reduzida se de fato o objeto de observação fosse a cidade em si, né? Obviamente tem algo para se colocar aí dentro, mas são processos reduzidos, pensando essa seleção, esse processo administrativo que ocorre, pensando a relação do Estado brasileiro com a UNESCO, né? Que é a construção do dossiê, a produção de metadados, que são as fichas que a própria UNESCO dá, e 2 pareceres, digamos assim, isso pensando em documentação, né? 2 pareceres, um parecer do ICOMOS sobre o pedido e o parecer da própria UNESCO sobre o pedido, né? Tipo assim, a ideia é que a gente não se atenha a esse processo da construção dos valores para a escolha dele como patrimônio, não necessariamente, por exemplo, os documentos que são relativos à gestão desse território, que aí é uma vastidão, né? Tipo, a maioria dessas cidades estão patrimonializadas nos anos 80, então você tem 40 anos de documentação pensando em gestão, né? O próprio Pelourinho, com as 2 reformas, acredito que seja até impossível de dar conta. Mas pensando oficialmente os processos, hoje eu tenho entendimento que eu consigo fazer uma articulação entre as 4 cidades, para poder, inclusive, responder a sua questão sobre essa ideia dessa cidade negra, dessa cidade escravista, né? E aí, eu acho que aqui faltou, talvez, na apresentação, talvez até no próprio texto, talvez falte em mim ainda, né? Algum amadurecimento a respeito dessa relação do processo oficial que o Estado brasileiro coloca e de como que esses coletivos negros, né, esses sujeitos, os atores políticos, estão reinterpretando esses sítios. Porque aí, tecnicamente, é exatamente essa distinção, né? A literatura vai falar de cidades escravistas ou cidades atlânticas, e esses sujeitos, esses coletivos, tendem a chamar essas mesmas cidades politicamente de cidades negras, pelo mesmo princípio, né? Um adensamento populacional que é negro no sentido de africanos escravizados, sobretudo, né? Pensando no período de formação dessas cidades, de uma cultura material que é produzida nessas cidades, que também sobretudo, eminentemente, desses africanos escravizados, seus descendentes, né, que esses sujeitos vão também reivindicar como essas heranças negras. Acho que a gente está vivendo um momento de disputa por exatamente pela interpretação desse passado, então essas interpretações vão nesse sentido de tentar politicamente acionar essa identidade da cidade como negra e não necessariamente no termo escravista. E aí, pensando nessas 4 cidades que eu coloco, né, Rio, Olinda, Salvador e São Luís, elas têm essa dinâmica atlântica, elas têm essa dinâmica escravista, e são 4 cidades marcadamente, né, hoje no presente, e foram no seu auge também, marcadamente racializadas, né? Então, assim, isso é nisso que eu tenho caminhado para pensar essa relação dela como uma cidade escravista atlântica e uma cidade negra no presente. Bom, é isso, né? E assim, e tecnicamente todas elas dentro do processo administrativo são valoradas no mesmo lugar, como uma cidade colonial que representa um esforço português de adaptação aos trópicos, né? Todas elas reforçam essa ideia de uma arquitetura que mostra uma genialidade dessa herança portuguesa em adaptar suas construções, suas dinâmicas aqui e produzindo um silenciamento profundo da escravidão mesmo como fundamento disso tudo, né? A escravidão some do processo, seja para reforçar essa ideia, ou seja para trazer uma outra camada para isso. É isso. Obrigado.
I'll start by saying thank you for your questions and comments, and thanks to the others on this panel as well. Please let me know if I don't answer something to your, we can continue talking later as well. But to the first question about presentist histories, and you mentioned the example of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which I think is a really apt example of exactly what you're asking. For these presentist histories that don't necessarily take a critical look of the past and instead have this, well, I'll give it as an example. In Michelle Alexander's book, she's not a historian, she's a legal scholar. And although that book was a massive catalyst in the field of carceral studies, really drawing our attention to the sheer scale, the mass, which was really crucial. Historians in response have written some really incredible books. She, like you mentioned, she takes us back in history to the war on drugs, which is not that far back. At the beginning of that as, again, sort of a catalyst for this increase in incarceration, when in reality other historians have come forward and said, we need to go back even further. It's actually the war on poverty. Oh, go back further. Actually, we need to look more critically. And so that's one of the critiques that has come out of that type of work, where it's a historical text in what she's aiming to do, but the analysis falls short a little bit, not only in not quite taking it far enough, or not quite taking it as analytically in the past, but also in the present. Her conclusion receives quite a bit of criticism as well in what she suggests moving forward, because she doesn't use that historical, I guess, skill to be able to look at maybe more of the roots and so on and so forth. So that's just an example that I think of. Let me see if I had anything else for that. I think the only other thing that I would like to say on the presentist histories is just that we see, especially something like with incarceration that's happening all around us, we see a public interest in it in addition to the academic interest. And unfortunately, with this sort of motivation for academics to keep producing academic work, we then leave scholarship that's public facing to those who may not have the historical training. And so we get pieces by those maybe who are not trained in the way that perhaps we are. Again, that's not meant to be as like a dig on anyone or any particular thing, but I think the sort of moving in a direction of also creating more public facing work could be one way to sort of, put the presentist histories more at bay. To answer the second question about gender as a factor, as well as other factors like immigration, national boundaries, citizenship, and so on, I think the easy answer to that question, which I won't linger on because I think it's also the lazy answer, is intersectionality, which requires, us to look at these as compounding factors and not as individual factors. Any scholar of race and anything else would be able to tell you that much. So I won't linger there, but I do think that's obviously one aspect of it. And I can think about 50 ways to approach the answer to this question, which I certainly won't do. So instead I'll take maybe 1.5. And that's just especially for looking at incarceration and what I study. One of the ways to do that is going back to the roots and looking at, okay, in the context of displacement, how that displacement happens. And we have all of these factors of socioeconomic status, race, religion, class, could go on forever. But if we look at both the purpose of incarceration and then the methods to displace or to incarcerate people, that sort of brings us down to some more core commonalities regardless of these other factions. So if we look at it as incarceration targeting, intentionally targeting poverty as a sort of response to poverty and racism is sort of, the in the soil of the US. And so I think it's one way to do that is to almost pull back rather than to lean into more categorizations and even more breakdowns. I think the representational history is incredibly important, like I said, moving forward, but just to sort of scale back to sort of the goals. And what I didn't get to share about is moving in a more transnational direction, hopefully in the future, as thinking of, okay, I'm considering carcerality as a tool of empire, for example. What does that look like in terms of social control and displacement? And hopefully by questioning those things, I can arrive at more of an answer. But for now, that's sort of what I have on that question. But thank you, I appreciate it.
First, thanks for the question, Dr. Gomes. Thanks to both of the panelists. And Taliesin, you're a master of the small paper with the number of minutes we have left. I think we all got over time, but oh, a little close to my mouth. Okay, sorry, it's making too much noise. Okay, so for the first question, what? Like this? Huh? Okay, did somebody earn me before? Or? Oh, yeah. In my previous life, I was a musician, yeah. Yes, so for the first question, before I was babbling too loud in the microphone, I'm gonna answer the question. So how representative it is, it's always a big question about microhistory. And maybe like we cannot know sometime like how representative of the rest a microhistorical treatment is gonna be, or should it be like generalized? So maybe like the microhistorical treatment, it's more about like trying to get a glimpse of the mental world of the person that wrote those texts, edited those texts, and tried to work in this cultural endeavor. Will we know for sure what he was thinking? We get in his personal correspondence, which is not available all the time. In that case, it is. And I was really lucky to have both correspondence early in his life and in the twilight of his life in 1928 and 1927. So as the circulation, he was published by Barnes, which was like kind of a big publisher at the time. He never made any money with the book, but he was reviewed by everything from the New York Times to the Cincinnati and all this. That's saying in its own. And just if you really want to do it, like, and I did it, just I was asking myself the same question, like, what is the circulation? And there's a fantastic tool that is called WorldCat, when you can see how many libraries still have this thing in their archive or their library. And it was kind of widely available. And I was even able to have a copy of this book full of evil and racist text on Amazon, which was even more evil. So this is maybe like my thing. So also like about like our representativity, and I think that would be my answer to that question. So but that's why I'm finishing also the text by saying that it came to fruition in the end of Utter. He was a bit earlier than the other Lost Cause apologists. The high tide of the United Daughter of the Confederacy is the 1890s. We don't, even for the Confederate associations, like most of them, it's going to be the 1880s. So it's kind of a bit before this. And like other historians like Jennings did in her book with The Limit of Reconciliation, the Memory of the Civil War, War. She's firmly anchoring like this lost cause and what is going to be next in Reconstruction era, which kind of like John Garland James is doing this also. He's blending texts about the Old South, the Civil War, and Reconstruction into one edited volume for students in both North, South, or whenever they wanted to have this book, and parent council were too outraged by it. So how do we negotiate the past? How do we know how much it influenced the next generation? Well, we know that he was like, and I didn't say it inside like the paper, but James Baker is not only one of the main architects of Rice University. He's also like a big businessman in Houston. So the Rice also attended the Texas Military Institute. So also not only big businessmen in Houston, but giving the name to, they were the family that gave the name to the university. So by recovering those people, we get also about the legacy of our institution that we were learning in, and like what is like those in the corridor, maybe, as like my friend Emily liked to talk about ghosts. So I think he had some kind of influence because the young Baker was so in a more, can I use in a more, maybe that's too much. He was so enamored with John Garland James then that he wanted to stay for another year at the Texas Military Academy, nearly for free before entering the law business of his father. So I don't know like all the link, but there's surely something like to do here. And you read it in the paper, but I had to cut it for the presentation, or else I would have been there for like 25 minutes and everybody would look at their cell phone. But he also tried to collect document. He wrote to the son of Ensign Jones, the last president of the Texas Republic, and he asked him, "Do you have document? Do you have document from that time? Do you have portrait of your father that like I can use? I want to know your version of history in a kind of way to enshrine it like into like maybe an history of Texas that was never published. So that would be my answer. And maybe doing some microhistory like this that is more accessible is a way also to discuss how we create narrative. And I think that's really important. I'm pretty sure there's the same kind of narrative that have been like shaped by men, racist narratives, sometimes like in Brazil, in other country also. And by recovering their mental world, we can ask those questions, and we can like not just say that those people were product of their time or they weren't that involved as other more vocal supporter in newspaper and all this. So that would be the long short answer, and thank you.
Thank you, Francisco, Nina, and Olivier. Eu vou abrir agora para as perguntas para o público. Nós temos tempo para as perguntas. If anyone in the audience wants to make any question, just raise your hand and the microphone will be taken to you by Ricardo. The first one is Bruno, I think.
Oi, vou sentar aqui. Para o Francisco, minha pergunta eu vou fazer em português. Eu queria saber se, nesse projeto, você já prevê casos em que o tombamento é questionado. Eu queria entender assim, qual é o mecanismo de revisão e se tem algum caso que já foi pedido algum tipo de revisão. Né? E acho que mais para uma reflexão qual, na sua opinião, seria o impacto dessa revisão. Né? O que ter um tombamento que é mais preciso e carrega uma linguagem que o movimento negro considera adequada e impacta nos processos de memorialização que decorrem do tombamento. Né?
Thank you for your presentation. My question is for Nina. I was kind of surprised by your comment that your research is not transnational. So it made me curious, about the women, incarcerated women. Are there like any foreign women or women who are daughters of immigrants? Because, I think your research might have the potential of being transnational.
Next one is Rebecca and then Drew, I guess.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Well, thanks for this great presentation. It's a high note to end on. To quote someone from this morning, "You're all rising stars." But I have a question for Nina and Olivier. Both of your papers sort of skirt around the issue of Texas. So what is, perhaps if you find Texas be a particular place, what's particular about it, both either in incarceration sort of scholarship or for the lost cause? And so that would, I think if you could expand on that a little bit more, that would be really helpful, as in someone who's actually not a Texan. Who is this? This go back to Drew? Here, I should climb over a chair too. It's only fair. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a question for Nina regarding just the framing of presentism here. And I know that you weren't able to get your interviews, but what were you expecting to find in those interviews, and how would that relate to presentism? Are these interviews that would be made uncomfortable through a presentist lens, or would a presentist narrative overlook these? I was just kind of, if you could speak more to that particular kind of framing.
Temos mais perguntas? Do you have any more questions? Acho que a gente pode fazer uma primeira bateria de respostas e depois fazemos outra. Sim.
Obrigado pela questão. Inclusive, me dá a oportunidade de falar um pouco melhor. Eu vou dizer, sendo bem objetivo, não, mas eu vou usar um exemplo de revisão que não é de cidade, mas que serve para o debate, no sentido do impacto, né? Que você questiona. Assim, hoje não existe agora, né? A respeito do tombamento de cidade ou qualquer outra patrimonialização pensando cidade ou algum sítio urbano desses no Brasil. A gente vai ter revisão de nome de rua, né? Algumas outras homenagens ou comemorações públicas, isso já existe, de fato. Mas pensando no tombamento, pensando no instrumento jurídico do tombamento, tem uma revisão recente que traz esse debate, que é um debate sobre reparação, justiça, né? E de como isso também impacta na garantia dos direitos no presente, que é a renomeação, né? E aí a ideia de que essa renomeação também pode trazer uma reinterpretação desse bem, né? E uma forma de você publicizar ou tornar pública essa narrativa sobre um determinado bem com um impacto no presente, digamos assim, tentando garantir aí os direitos sociais da população afro-brasileira, por exemplo. Aí dois exemplos, mas o primeiro exemplo é o Museu da Magia Negra, é o antigo Museu da Magia Negra, né, que é um espólio de batidas policiais no Rio de Janeiro, que a própria Museu da Polícia, na verdade, um funcionário do Museu da Polícia organiza esse acervo que é construído por batidas policiais em terreiros de umbanda, candomblé, culto doméstico, e ele inclusive, das artimanhas do racismo, né, ele é o primeiro bem etnográfico patrimonializado no Brasil, né? Ele é o bem número 1 do livro de patrimônio etnográfico, que é o Museu da Magia Negra, que, na verdade, serve um tombamento que serve, no fim das contas, mais para esconder o acervo do que dar visibilidade ao acervo. Só que um movimento recente, principalmente desses afro-religiosos, sobretudo, que as lideranças são todas mulheres, elas começam a reivindicar esse acervo e a guarda do acervo também, mas, sobretudo, a nomeação desse acervo, para ele deixar de chamar, né, de Museu da Magia Negra e passar a chamar Acervo Nosso Sagrado. E é o que acontece, né? Agora, da pandemia, e aí talvez minha cabeça me traia, mas é 20 ou 21, esse acervo vai ao Museu da República, renomeado agora como esse Acervo Nosso Sagrado, e a direção do museu chama essas lideranças afro-religiosas para participarem de uma segunda nomeação, assim, desse acervo, desses objetos, para pensar guarda, para pensar conservação, né? Alguns objetos são sacralizados segundo essas lideranças, então até a maneira de limpar algum desses instrumentos está sendo negociado com essas lideranças e alguns religiosos para acompanhar o processo. Tudo isso tem tem acontecido, né? E um outro caso é exatamente o debate sobre as docas Pedro II, ou como o movimento negro também reivindica no Rio de Janeiro também, como docas André Rebouças, né? O processo de tombamento é muito interessante, porque o técnico que aprova o tombamento diz que aprova, mas aprova aquele tombamento porque aquilo é uma edificação da Marinha brasileira. Como era uma doca e está em área de marinha, aquilo tem valor de patrimônio para o Brasil, mas tem valor como uma arquitetura de marinha, né? Só que o processo ele abre e ele é construído como... e aí a gente pode, né, conversar mais disso, mas assim, ele é como se aquilo materializasse a luta dos sujeitos negros pela abolição, né? No caso, a figura do André Rebouças, sobretudo aquela ideia de que aquele prédio não utilizou mão de obra escrava na sua edificação. E assim, ele é tombado pela essa chave, né, de que aquilo representa toda a organização do povo negro no Brasil pela abolição, pelo fim da escravidão. E isso acaba, assim, pensando materialidade, talvez a gente não tenha no Brasil ainda um debate tão amadurecido sobre reparação financeira, né? Mas todo esse debate em torno das memórias nacionais, desses patrimônios nacionais, acho que eles acabam contribuindo. Acabam não, né? Acho não, tenho certeza. Eles contribuem nesse sentido, desse reforço desses direitos sociais da população negra, né? Tão tal que a gente vai ter isso atualmente, tanto para denunciar a violência contra a população negra, tanto para garantir a lei de cotas, né? o próprio acesso de cotas ao serviço público. Todo um debate sobre os direitos sociais do negro, no fim das contas, acabam sendo atravessados por esses bens, né? E reforçando aquela ideia da 10.639, de como que você tem um combate ao racismo efetivo quando você passa a valorizar a história do Brasil a partir desse viés da população afro-brasileira. É isso. Obrigado.
Okay, got a couple questions, so I'll try to keep it relatively brief, at least. Dr. Dominguez, I'm not sure I got just the last few words of your question. Were you asking why it's not a transnational study, or how it would be if I incorporated, how I would go about it? I think I missed just the last few words you said.
Yeah, I understood that you mentioned that your research is not international, whereas I think it has potential of being international. And I was wondering when many of the women you interview or planning to do are, for example, immigrants or daughters of immigrants.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think my hope is for it to be, right, a transnational project in more than one way, but I think this is one way that's perhaps the next step in making that leap. If you think of borders as incarceration, right, that's one way that I approach this, especially being in Texas, where we have the national border. In short, yes, I'm still in the recruitment process of talking to people to have them in my study. But yes, in short, having immigrants, different generations of immigrants, having, I mean, all sorts of, diversity is definitely part of the plan. And so I think it'll come up more so in the questioning in terms of, trying to understand how they've sort of arrived where they are. I think that sort of family history can play a very big role in that. And so I think this is a good way to situate the future of the project towards a more transnational focus. Ideally in the future, right, maybe after this, this dissertation, I'd love to look at other forms of incarceration. Right now, I'm just focusing on prisons and jails, but you have borders, you have black sites, you have detention camps, you have all over the world by the U.S. and then obviously by other countries as well. But I think that's definitely the future direction. And but it gives me a good sort of suggestion for at least maybe opening up that as an avenue of conversation as well with them, is to talk about the sort of the transnational approach that could even be just from talking to women in Texas as well. To answer the second question, Rebecca's question about why Texas, because it's the, no. Sorry, I wish I could say that, and I really can't with all my heart. Well, for one reason, and I hate to be so practical, but this little pandemic thing we just went through, being able to do your research around where you live, you know, I know that that's kind of a cop-out of an answer, but largely that's one of the reasons, is not necessarily being able to go through the hoops to take my project elsewhere, and knowing that there's a lot that's right in Texas, that's right in our backyard, at least as a starting point, like I mentioned. And so that's sort of the practical answer. A little bit more academic of an answer, perhaps, is just Texas's rich history with slavery and with incarceration. Specifically, we have an unfortunately rich history of labor camps and things like that. And so we do have sources not only documenting that, but also women's experiences with that. And so I can't say that that's the same across the South. It's definitely not the same across the United States. But that's one of the sort of main reasons why Texas. The third question. Also, that troubling statistic you show us. Troubling, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that should say quite a bit. And I have that graph, but it's with all of the countries and all of the United States as if they're, you know, as separate entities. And I think it's there's like 44 states before a nation enters, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it was too long of a graph to put in a slide. But yes, troubling the rate of incarceration, that, and then also combined with the troubling statistics about motherhood, and so on and so forth. The last sort of question about from Drew, about what would have potentially changed. I think the main thing in my mind that would have changed is I was really hoping not to come to yet another conference and present something very theoretical without having done any what feels like real work. And so being able to have examples, for example, I listed in all those bubbles. If we look at even something like let's say community building as resistance, as an act of resistance, and what that looks like. My hope was that after having done interviews, I could take these individual instances of community building as resistance and tie them very concretely to a history of community building as resistance, and sort of use that to spearhead more of an argument about presentism and about using the framework or mentality of women in the present day who have a lot to say about what they think should happen with the carceral system, to make inferences on the past rather than sort of proposing this is what I hope to do. So that's sort of the biggest shift. Being able to use specific examples. I presented with RUM last year and also had a very theoretical sort of paper. And so my hope was grand, but we're here today still talking about it. So I'm just happy to be here and to be able to do that, to be honest. Yes, thanks for the great questions, everybody. I appreciate it.
Ooh, I'm getting scared of talking in the microphone now that I'm. So I was really loud, but to answer your question, Rebecca Shining Star Earls, like this, 2 fists away. Okay, I could just talk without it, maybe. All right, cool.
But you need it for the
okay. Okay, cool. Okay, broadcasting. So I'm just gonna hold it like this. So what makes Texas special? There's always that question. What makes Texas sometimes not special? That's another question. John Garland James was from Virginia. He fought also in Virginia. He was thinking of himself as a Virginian, and he was interacting with the elite in Texas also. So that doesn't mean that he didn't enter those close circle of Texan, because and it's not in that article, but at VMI, they were linking with the elite of Houston, and we're talking about Throckmorton, who was famous for being the governor in the early Reconstruction era. a vibrant Confederate veteran that like was against like African American citizenship in a way, but also the military intervention on the border with Mexico. And there's also Alexander Terrell, Watkin Terrell, which son is going to be at the Texas Military Academy, most famous in Texas for being one of the architects of segregation. So in a lot of way, he was into like those network, but he's still a Virginian, and sometimes like it's hard for me, especially for John Garland James, to say that Texas was special because, and I forgot maybe to mention it, he opened the Texas Military Institute with his brothers. His brother were former cadet from the Virginia Military Institute, and they even had like their friend that used to bunk bed with them at the Virginia Military Institute, Dean Wendy's. That's gonna be at Texas A&M afterward also. So this network, I think we should like sometimes see it as like Texas maybe like helping them create this academy, but at the same time they're foreigner to Texas. But at another time there's migration all over the place in the aftermath of the Civil War, so that's complicating the notion about an essentialization of the Texas identity, if that makes sense. And I did use the word essentialization, so yeah. And maybe like asking the question, what makes it like a Texas story, is going to be more in an article that I'm preparing about James A. Baker, also micro history, that I'm going to publish. So him, it's more complicated because he see the new South as being the new West at the same time, and it's kind of overlapping, and there's like overlapping of idea, and it's becoming interesting because there's a sense of like he's at the frontier, and Houston is like this city that like is bridging the like the business of the North and the opening door to the West also. And he's gonna act as this. He's gonna be like a famous like lawyer, and people, when they wanted to do business in Houston, they would reach the cabinet of like James A. Baker Jr., also chairman of the board at Rice University. So I wasn't too loud for answering that last question. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to the panelists also.
I was gonna say that we still have some time for more questions, even though I don't know if we still have any more energy. O Ricardo está fazendo o sinal ali para... Bom, bom, com isso, com essas apresentações ótimas, nós finalizamos a última mesa do nosso seminário. Gostaria de agradecer a todos que participaram. Acho que o Ricardo gostaria de fazer as considerações finais sobre o evento.
No, I just want to say thank you very much for you all. We had a very productive seminar. It was great to have you all here, and I hope I can meet you all again, maybe in the next seminar in Houston or in Mexico next time. Thank you very much.
Yes, the next seminar will be in Houston at Rice University, and we have a theme. What is our theme? Contested narratives. Memories, sites, and monuments. Okay. Okay, so be thinking about your paper topics. The call will come out at the end of August, and you'll need to submit an abstract. And then the way the Rice-Unicamp-Mora seminar works is that the hosting university pays for the rooms and meals. And thank you very much, Ricardo. The accommodations. The accommodations were wonderful. And everyone pays their travel, so everyone needs to apply for funding to come to Houston. So we hope to see you all there next year, 2024, probably the end of April. We're still not sure on the date.
Thank you. No, just a moment. Tomorrow we're going to have a workshop with Daniel Dominguez. I know many of you are leaving today, but for the others who are staying here, you are all well invited to the workshop of Daniel Dominguez. At 9:30 or 9? No, it's 9. It's 9. It's 9. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the folder is wrong.